The problem of demarcation. Many discussions in many branches of philosophy seem to be entirely abstract and irrelevant to our daily lives. One of the things that has attracted me to the philosophy of science, aside from my general interest in the sciences, is that there are at least a few issues there that seem to me to be extremely relevant. One of the most relevant problems within the philosophy of science for our lives in Western culture today is the problem of demarcation. The problem of demarcation is the problem of how we are to draw the line between that which we consider to be science and that which we consider to be not science, whatever it may be. And it seems to arise from the fact that there are certain fields of study that we would unquestionably want to classify as scientific, such as physics and chemistry, and there are other fields that we would certainly want to classify as not scientific. The most usual ones to throw around, likely as much for their psychological effect as anything else, are astrology and voodoo. If there are some fields which are scientific and some which are not scientific, then it seems reasonable to ask what it is about the former that sets them off from the latter. It's important to note that finding the line of demarcation between science and not science has not always been a great concern for philosophers. During the early days of the scientific revolution, many of those who made great strides forward in science were philosophers and even theologians. There was a sense in which science, philosophy, and theology could live harmoniously together and mutually influence and inspire one another. This is a relatively recent concern, by which I mean it's probably less than 200 years old. It might be said that demarcation only really became a problem as science became more and more identified with a purely empiricist and naturalistic philosophy, where the only thing that matters is our strictly natural experiences. If this is the case, then if we may assume, as in fact it was assumed, that science was the only really reliable source of knowledge, then we may conclude that it is important to find a general distinction between science and not science, because if we do not, then someone may make the grave mistake of thinking that claims made about realities beyond our experience or that go beyond what is accountable in strictly naturalistic terms are on the same level as scientific claims. The most obvious enemy to this kind of thinking, scientific thinking it would seem, was theology. Claims about God, even simply that God exists, cannot but be claims about the supernatural. However, theology is not the only field that makes claims that were deemed metaphysical and hence unacceptable for real knowledge. Pseudoscience had become a problem with the widely accepted relevance of studies such as astrology and phrenology, and it had to be clear that some things were science and some things were not. So how do people try to deal with the problem of demarcation? Famously, the logical positivists such as A.J. Ayer suggested that if things are to even be considered meaningful, they had to pass the test of verifiability. That is to say, if something is to be even made sense, let alone be true, it had to be verifiable. This had the advantage of dealing with some of the more problematical theological and philosophical claims in one fell swoop. If you define what is and is not meaningful in terms of what can be verified by the five senses, then any kind of talk about God is easily dismissed as merely meaningless. You never need to argue that claims regarding the existence of God are wrong or false. You can merely be dismissed as meaningless. It's easy to see how this would be an extremely attractive solution to the problem of demarcation. However, it has some crippling problems. For example, simply because we are speaking about something that does not exist in the real world does not mean that our statements are necessarily meaningless. After all, we can speak about unicorns and make perfectly good sense without necessarily believing that unicorns exist. However helpful such a position might be in the philosophy of science, it is intuitively extremely unsatisfying. Further, it conflicted with another important element of science as it was understood at the time. Science, it was believed, was about making universal statements. But how can a universal statement ever be verified? Suppose I want to make the claim that all ravens are black. How could that ever be verified? You could observe millions of black ravens, and yet the statement could never be verified because there might be an albino raven in the next tree that you haven't seen yet. The fact that the statement, there exists at least one white raven, can be verified makes no real difference because that is not a universal statement, and thus would not have been considered scientific. It should be noted that, in terms of the problem of demarcation that we started out to address, this emphasis on verification tries to accomplish too much. It does not attempt to draw a line between science and not science, but between meaningful statements and meaningless ones. Construing the problem of demarcation in terms of meaning, especially if meaning is to be judged from an empiricist point of view, is inherently problematic. Karl Popper pointed out that if you admit as meaningful none except problems in natural science, any debate about the concept of meaning will also turn out to be meaningless. Also, all you have to do is to fix it upon a conveniently narrow meaning for meaning, and you will soon be bound to say of any inconvenient question that you are unable to detect any meaning in it. It can therefore come as no surprise to note that Popper was one of the greatest enemies of the verification criterion of meaning. However, he was not interested in renouncing the quest for a satisfactory solution to the problem of demarcation. Popper suggested that what distinguished science from not science was falsifiability. That is to say, claims can be scientific if they are falsifiable, and they cannot be scientific if they are not. The ideal Popperian case would be that claims should be accompanied, explicitly or implicitly, by a specification of what information could come along that would falsify the claim. Perhaps the greatest example of this kind of claim, though he did so before Popper's greatest exposition of his views, was put forward by Albert Einstein. After pointing out several implications of relativity theory, he said, "The chief attraction of the theory lies in its logical completeness. If a single one of the conclusions drawn from it proves wrong, it must be given up. To modify it without destroying the whole structure seems to be impossible." It's interesting to speculate on whether Popper's solution would have seemed so plausible had a scientist of such stature not already articulated his own position in terms that would so strongly resemble Popper's. Popper's concern was that certain fields tended to reinforce themselves, being transformed from a way to learn new things about the world to being a way to force all the facts of the world into a preconceived structure. That is, he was concerned that we might think that something is scientific when it's really a worldview, which conditions everything it takes into itself. In particular, he did not approve of psychology, as he understood it to be practiced at the time. He writes of an irritating experience. "Once in 1919, I reported to Alfred Adler a case which to me did not seem particularly Adlerian, but which he found no difficulty in analyzing in terms of his theory of inferiority feelings, although he had not even seen the child. Slightly shocked, I asked him how he could be so sure. 'Because of my thousandfold experience,' he replied, whereupon I could not help but saying, 'And with this new case, I suppose, your experience has become 1,001-fold.'" Popper was singularly unimpressed by theories that could accommodate any conceivable data. If a scientific theory was to be useful, it had to rule certain experiences out of bounds. That way, if we should find that experience is inconsistent with our theory, we will have learned something, namely that our theory wasn't good enough and we need to find another one. Now, it's likely that many people have heard about the use of falsification as a solution for the problem of demarcation, even if it has not been in those particular terms. It's believed by many, at least among non-scientists, to be a sufficient solution to deciding what is scientific and what is not. Indeed, such a position has established itself to a degree in the American legal definition of science, at least as regards what may or may not be taught in science classrooms, an issue to which we shall return. Part of the problem is that there are certain claims that we would not want to consider scientific which are falsifiable. For example, a friend of mine suggested that he could advance a theory that, due to microscopic black holes, the universe as we now know it will disappear suddenly in 10 billion years. This is a falsifiable claim, and it even makes a novel prediction, which will be important later as we shall see, and yet we would certainly be inclined to say that it is not scientific. More significantly, there are certain claims that we would like to consider scientific that are not falsifiable. Popper, for example, that great champion of falsificationism as the basis of science, did not believe that Darwinian evolution was falsifiable and therefore not scientific. Rather, it was an overarching research program. Now, it has been argued that Popper was wrong in his appraisal of evolution, and so it's a fairly weak example. However, consider the great example used to stress the importance of being scientific as opposed to rejecting science on the basis of things like a particular interpretation of the Bible, the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory claims that the universe was once an incredibly dense state which exploded and has been expanding ever since. Now, there is no significant divergence from consensus within the scientific community on this claim. However, it is ultimately, inherently unfalsifiable. We are unable to go back in time and observe that this was the case. We can point to all kinds of things that seem to be consistent with the Big Bang Theory, such as the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation. These discoveries provide evidence that the Big Bang theory is onto something and decide in its favor relative to other competing theories, such as the steady-state theory championed by Fred Hoyle. However, in spite of all of this evidence, which is quite convincing, it doesn't change the fact that the basic claim at stake is unfalsifiable. We cannot repeat it experimentally, and we can only piece together clues. It's precisely this kind of example which shows us that we cannot use repeatability as a criterion for why something is scientific rather than non-scientific. We cannot repeat the Big Bang, nor can we set up another universe to see whether it will expand too. And yet this is no reason to reject these claims as unscientific. We've come no further to a solution of the problem of demarcation. As it happens, at any line one cares to draw between science and not science is doomed to fail, because it will either exclude something that one wants to include something one wants to exclude, or, what is more likely the case, both. In this way, the problem of demarcation is really nothing more than a special case of the classical problem of universals. How can we take two human beings who are different in every particular and use the single term human to classify them together? What is it that makes a human a human? The problem has proved to be intractable. Is there a better solution? Can we say absolutely nothing about what makes something science? Perhaps we may. Ludwig Wittgenstein provided an interesting approach to the problem of universals. Consider how he sets the stage for the discussion. Consider, for example, the activities that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, athletic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say they must have something in common or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you won't see something that is common to all, but similarities, affinities, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. Look, for example, at board games with their various affinities. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out and others appear. When we pass next to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are they all entertaining? Compare chess with noughts and crosses. Or is there always winning and losing, or competition between players? Think of patience. In ball games, there is winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of singing and dancing games. Here we have the element of the entertainment, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? And we can go through the many other groups of games in the same way. We can see how similarities crop up and disappear. Wittgenstein suggests that games are classed together because they share family resemblances. It's conceivable that we could say that various scientific fields are bound together in precisely analogous way. If this is so, we can say that there is no one thing that sets science apart from not science, but a whole host of similarities and affinities which we cannot specify definitively without reducing the distinction to absurdity. However, we must ask the question, would this solution be deemed acceptable? And the answer to this is almost certainly not. Other definitions of science given to me by practicing physicists that are similarly defensible, yet would also seem to be dissatisfactory, are science is what scientists do, and what can be said to be seen as even more cynical, science is what you can convince scientific funding agencies to fund. Why is it that these solutions are almost certainly to be seen as unacceptable to those who are seeking a line of demarcation between science and not science? After all, it seems to be the only thing that shows promise of providing such a line. The fundamental reason why these kinds of solutions to the problem of demarcation are likely to be seen as unacceptable is that they are inherently flexible definitions, rooted in practice rather than theoretic reflection. Such definitions are only relatively useful as gatekeepers for the scientific community. If sciences are understood to be scientific because they bear a family resemblance to other sciences, it might seem to many that we have nothing more than a circular definition. We would also be making the line of demarcation into a thing which is up for interpretation, which is precisely what cannot be the case if it is to adequately mark science off from metaphysical, theological, and pseudoscientific claims. It is here that we see that what actually might be the key issue at stake in the contemporary search for a solution of the problem of demarcation. Religion has not died out of the Western world as it was once expected to. Science has come under attack by postmodern philosophers. Intellectual positions such as young earth creationism and intelligent design have established institutions, raised incredible amounts of money, and demanded that they be taught in science classrooms. If we do not have a robust solution to what demarcates science from not science that can give us a good reason to accept physics, chemistry, and biology while rejecting astrology, creationism, and intelligent design, how can science maintain the influence it has gained in our society? Perhaps the last major philosophical position bent on solving the problem of demarcation, though it does not explicitly draw attention to that fact, goes by the name of scientific realism. In effect, scientific realism, as it is discussed within the philosophy of science, claims that the best of our theories are approximately true, and that this is why they are successful in various ways. Much has been made of the so-called no miracles argument, which runs like this when expressed formally. Major premise: we cannot appeal to the miraculous as an explanation as to why science is successful. Minor premise: if our best theories were not approximately true, their success could not be explained except as a miracle. Conclusion: therefore, our best theories must be approximately true. This argument seems to be quite sound, and it has seemed to many people that it must be true. However, there are many undefined terms in the argument that really require clarification. For example, what do we mean when we say miracle? Do we have something concrete in mind, or are we using the term for its psychological effects? What exactly is meant by approximate truth? We might also want to ask why one should agree to the minor premise that our choice is only between approximate truth and the miraculous. Is there any real reason to affirm this dichotomy? When one examines these kinds of objections, and the response they either receive or do not receive in the philosophical literature, it seems that rejecting this kind of realism is not altogether unreasonable. What is meant by miraculous is seldom, if ever, explored. When pressed, it has been the practice of scientific realists for the past few decades to say that the approximate truth only applies to mature theories. So we ask what it means for the theory to be mature, and it's claimed that it makes novel predictions and it's empirically supported, which moves us uncomfortably close to the views which, as we've already seen, have some significant problems. More interesting still are the explanations of what is meant by approximate truth. One gets the feeling that one's trying to hit a moving target. What is claimed to be meant by approximate truth has been modified by so many ad hoc changes that it hardly bears any resemblance to the kind of thing most people would associate with the words approximate and truth, the very associations which gave the argument above its force. At its best, it seems that saying our theories are approximately true means nothing more than that, when looked at from decades or centuries later, we can make an argument that even though the theory as a whole was replaced and put on an entirely different conceptual basis, there are some elements that are maintained in a kind of continuity through the theoretical changes. The dichotomy between approximate truth and the miraculous is also strained. Even if we can claim this for our current theories, we still have a history of theories which were considered successful at the time, which we now consider to not be approximately true, except in the highly non-intuitive revisionist sense just described. If we cannot allow the miracles to happen, or if we can't allow miracles to explain the success of our current theories, we surely cannot use them to explain the success of past theories, which we now consider to be far from the truth. The reason we have gone on this somewhat long diversion is because it makes it clear how difficult it is to maintain any sharp distinction between science and not science, even within the discipline which is dedicated to trying to solve problems like this. Scientific realism is saying, in effect, you should believe in science rather than other things like metaphysics, philosophy, theology, or pseudoscience, because it is better than those other things because, unlike them, scientific theories are approximately true. This would be quite convincing if approximate truth meant what it sounds like it should mean. However, it is, in fact, a highly technical term which would lose its persuasive force if it was realized how far from our common sense it really is. It was claimed at the beginning of this essay that the problem of demarcation is very much relevant to our lives today. A reflection on how this issue gets played out in contemporary culture is appropriate. On December 20th, 2004, in its decision in the case Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District, the United States District Court for the Middle District of Pennsylvania ruled that intelligent design was not to be taught in public schools. The relevance of this decision for the problem of demarcation is that it claimed that, beyond any question of whether objective people would interpret the teaching of intelligent design in the science classroom as an endorsement of religion by the government, the subject should not be taught in science classroom because it was not science. Because of the difficulty the philosophical community has had to solve the problem of demarcation, it's entirely reasonable to ask what the court used as its rationale to declare something to be not science. The court cites the opinion of the National Academy of Sciences. Creationism, intelligent design, and other claims of supernatural intervention in the origin of life or of species are not science because they are not testable by the methods of science. These claims subordinate observed data to statements based on authority, revelation, or religious beliefs. Documentation offered in support of these claims is typically limited to the special publications of their advocates. These publications do not offer hypotheses subject to change in light of new data, new interpretations, or demonstrations of error. This contrasts with science, where any hypothesis or theory always remains subject to the possibility of rejection or modification in the light of new knowledge. Additionally, during the proceedings, the court heard expert testimony from Kenneth R. Williams, professor of biology at Brown University. Williams testified, "Theories are broad, useful, powerful generalizations that explain and unite a broad range of facts. Theories have to make testable predictions, because otherwise they're not useful as theories. If a theory is enunciated to explain a natural process, it has to make predictions that lead to testable hypotheses so that people can go into the laboratory, can make those tests, and can tend to confirm or refute the theory." In order to clarify what was being stated, the court asked Professor Miller, "But if a theory does not meet these ground rules of science, testability, observability, they are not considered scientific?" He responded, "It's just not a scientific theory. That's correct. And my tongue-in-cheek explanation of a baseball playoffs last year falls into exactly that category. It's not a theory because it's not scientific and it's not testable." The official decision of the court gave or confirmed the falsification criterion of demarcation legal status and weight in the U.S. This is an incredibly interesting move because, while it has worked wonderfully to give a reason why intelligent design and creationism should not be taught in public schools, it seems to be unaware of the fact that falsification as a means of demarcation is not above critique, as we have seen. It would seem that, according to this decision, anything that we would normally want to consider scientific, but which is not falsifiable, and we've already seen that such topics exist, should also not be allowed to be taught in science classrooms in American public schools. A very motivated, intelligent, and well-funded individual or group could conceivably make such a case and create an awkward situation for the courts. Either retract the decision of Kitzmiller v. Dover, or else ban the teaching of those other topics in public schools. Any number of quotations from science advocates and popularizers from a previous generation, such as Carl Sagan, reveal, in addition to allusions to falsifiability, deep commitment to the practice of scientists. Seldom pinning down a more specific answer to what science is beyond saying that it is a way of thinking or a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. Even in these kinds of statements, the stress is not so much on the falsifiability of our theories, but of the scientists. Contrast this with the kind of philosophy of science advocated by someone like Bill Nye in the context of his debate with creationist Ken Ham. Nye repeatedly takes the line similar to that of Professor Williams quoted above, that what sets science apart from not science is falsifiability and the ability to make novel predictions. There were also numerous appeals that showed remarkable rhetorical sophistication and contextual awareness. Nye repeatedly appealed to the taxpayers and voters in the room to take his side because, as he saw it, to accept creationism is to fail with regard to science. To fail with regard to science is to fail with regard to technology and engineering, and to fail with regard to technology and engineering will result in America no longer being great. Given the stereotype of the people who live in the part of America where the debate was held, it was a savvy approach. The shadow of Kitzmiller v. Dover looms large over this shift in the language of science advocate and popularizers. Science is no longer to be seen as investigating the reality which exists independently of us, which can call us and our most cherished beliefs into question. Rather, it is a means to an end, a way to keep America great in the midst of international turmoil. It is not something that is seen to be able to stand on its own 2 feet and claim superiority based on its own merits. It is something whose authority must be affirmed and bolstered by a federal court, or else its rivals would threaten to overwhelm it. This doesn't sound like the science that I have valued and want the next generations learning about. The kind of science which has proved so valuable is not one that has slavishly followed a set of rules that says from the very beginning, this is what science is, follow these rules and you will end up with scientific results. The only field where this kind of guarantee can be made is formal logic, which loses this certainty the moment it's applied to the actual world in which we live instead of merely the realm of ideas. What do we have to learn from the repeated failure to solve the problem of demarcation? It seems to me that science is more defined by its practice rather than by a theoretical justification, and that the practice of a given science is to be determined by the object of that science's study. If the object of study is such that falsification and repeatability can be achieved, then we should do so. But we should not imagine that it's helpful to decide in advance that these elements must be present. Science is not an authority in itself, but derives its authority from actually tapping into the depths of reality. I'm a Christian theologian, so I have something at stake in the solution of the problem of demarcation. While I do not think that the theological convictions at a particular point in time should forever condition what conclusions are allowable in the natural sciences, I do not think that either theology or natural science is served by clamping down rules for procedure and granting them legal authority. I believe that reality itself should be the final court of appeal. Which brings us to a final consideration. I am convinced that there is a way for Christian theology to be scientific, at least within certain contexts. Obviously, if one of the requirements of science is that the supernatural or the metaphysical is to be ruled out, then Christian theology cannot be scientific, but neither can other such fields like philosophy. It is the Christian conviction that not only does God exist, this God has been made accessible to us through Jesus Christ, God in human flesh. If this is so, and this is not inherently any less intellectually credible than the belief that our senses are not systematically deceived when we observe the world, then the only appropriate and scientific response would be to engage with Christ in as rigorous a way as possible, allowing our preconceptions about God to be challenged like a natural scientist allows her preconceptions about the natural world to be challenged by her engagement with it. The objection might be raised, but if we take this approach, it is conceivable that astrology and voodoo could be considered scientific someday. I'm convinced that this is either intentionally or unintentionally propaganda, a claim made more for its psychological impact on the hearer rather than as an actual argument. Why should we fear that astrology and voodoo might be considered scientific? Either there are aspects of reality which they are tapping into, or not. If there are not, then there would seem that they can never achieve truly robust knowledge, even in their own field. If there are really phenomena that are best described and explained by astrology and voodoo, then we should welcome them into the scientific community. We should press astrologers and voodoo practitioners to do rigorous work, to clarify their thinking as much as possible, and to bring their fields into dialogue with the other sciences. The appropriate solution to the problem of demarcation is not to impose a legal or philosophical requirement which determines ahead of time what is and is not to be considered scientific, but to press for rigorous thinking in every field with the conviction that truth will be justified by her works.